May 5th, 1945. 0720 hours. Western Hungary, a market square gutted by shellfire and winter. Staff Sergeant Jack Mercer of the U.S. 101st stood in the doorway of a shattered bakery, watching civilians emerge like shadows, learning to be human again. He'd traveled through liberated France and Belgium and thought he knew what relief looked like. Flags, laughter, wine. Instead, they came slowly, shuffling, elders bent like century-old trees, women supporting one another, children who seemed carved from air and bone. A girl, perhaps 7, wore a dress cinched 3 times with twine to chase a body that had been shrinking for months. Her eyes were immense in a skull too light for her wooden clogs. When Mercer's jeep braked, she didn't wave. She swayed. He knelt, pulled a D-ration bar, and held it out. For a heartbeat she stared as if afraid to hope. Then her hand flashed, the chocolate vanished against her chest, and tears cut bright tracks through the dust. "Thank you," she breathed in careful English, as though a louder word might shatter the moment. Behind her, the street kept filling. 20 children, then 30, then scores, all the same mixture of awe and disbelief. Mercer looked at his squad and saw their faces harden with a different kind of resolve. "Open everything," he said quietly. "All of it. These kids are starving." What followed was chaos of the only kind anyone wanted. Soldiers cutting open crates, handing out crackers and corned beef, splitting their personal rations to stretch one more portion. Medics lifting listless toddlers and checking pulses. Mothers folded to their knees, fathers covered their faces and sobbed without sound, and veterans who'd survived hedgerows and artillery realized nothing in combat had prepared them for the sight of a child's hands shaking around a biscuit. In this place, liberation meant food first, breath second, joy later. It had not been an accident. Starvation here had been policy and weather and siege welded together into a machine that ground families flat. Across western and central Hungary, the number of civilians caught in the spiral reached into the millions. Deaths directly tied to hunger rose by the thousands. Children lost made up an awful share. By February 1945, daily calories for many families had fallen to scraps, sometimes 400 to 800, sometimes nothing for days when rail lines were cut and carts were confiscated. Heating fuel was gone by midwinter. Ration shops closed for whole weeks. The descent had a rhythm survivors could chart in notebooks and on doorframes. First, the cupboards thinned and parents lied cheerfully about how full they were. Then, furniture burned in stoves and gardens yielded their last roots. Pets vanished from courtyards. By January, people boiled weeds and ground acorns, anything to make soup that tasted like memory. By March, children fainted at the few schools still open, and doctors wrote hard words in soft pencils, marasmus, edema, night blindness, while praying the war would move on. When the Americans finally reached these towns at the same hour, surrender was unraveling every front. The numbers turned back into faces. Command posts became kitchens. Field stoves ran without pause. Units diverted trucks from ammo dumps to bread lines. Engineers fixed pumps. Bakers borrowed ovens. Chaplains organized queues and whispered blessings no one had the strength to answer aloud. A boy with stick-thin legs saluted with a cracker and introduced himself as Andor. A grandmother tried to pay with a wedding ring and was told to keep it, to save it for the day her grandson grew into a world with birthdays again. On every corner, someone cried when a child swallowed without wincing. On every step, a soldier looked away so he could keep handing out cans. If this story matters to you, help us keep it alive. Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what moment hit you hardest so more people hear how compassion turned hunger into hope. The soldiers moved methodically through the town, but no amount of training could prepare them for what they saw in the cellars beneath the ruins. Entire families had dug themselves into the earth, emerging only when the noise of tanks faded and the smell of food filled the air. Corporal Henry Lewis recalled finding a woman clutching a bundle of blankets that turned out to be a boy no older than 5, unconscious but still breathing. He hadn't eaten in nearly a week, Lewis wrote later. His mother kept whispering to him, trying to make him wake up because she thought we were angels. She thought if he opened his eyes, he'd see heaven. The medics took the boy to the nearest field hospital, feeding him teaspoons of soup every hour. He survived. Dozens of others did not. By the 3rd day of liberation, the crisis had transformed from a battlefield emergency into a humanitarian operation of staggering scale. The Americans, joined by British and Canadian medical teams, established supply depots in abandoned factories. Food convoys ran 24 hours a day, guarded not against enemy fire, but against chaos born of hunger. Yet the civilians did not riot. They lined up in silence, parents carrying infants wrapped in rags, children clutching metal cups and waiting their turn for whatever the soldiers could spare. The discipline was born not of obedience, but exhaustion. They had no strength left for desperation. When Major Harold Benton, commander of the relief column, filed his report to headquarters, it contained only one line that mattered: immediate and total food relief required. Civilian population on edge of total collapse. His tone was clinical, but those who served under him remembered his eyes, red, unblinking, hollowed out by the weight of what he'd seen. Benton ordered his men to distribute their personal emergency rations first, then ration packs from the trucks, then anything edible within reach. "We'll figure out the logistics later," he told his logistics officer. "These people don't have later." In the southern quarter of the town, a scene unfolded that none of the soldiers would ever forget. A group of children, thin as shadows, stood before a truck piled high with rations. Among them, a boy named Miklos, perhaps 10, watched silently as the soldiers opened cans of corned beef. His sister, Anna, barely 6, stared up with wide, hungry eyes. When Mercer offered them food, they hesitated, unsure if it was real. Finally, Anna reached out and took a cracker, then another for her brother. She didn't eat. She handed both to him. When Mercer asked why, she said softly, "He's older. He needs to be strong." The soldier dropped to one knee and gave her his entire ration pack. She smiled for the first time since the war began. That night, as fires burned in stoves for the first time in months, the town began to change. The smell of cooking drifted through shattered windows. Children who had forgotten how to play began chasing each other through the streets. Soldiers shared cigarettes and laughter with men who, days earlier, had been too weak to stand. For the first time since the siege, there was sound, human sound, music, voices, crying that didn't come from pain but relief. And through it all, the Americans kept working, distributing food until their own packs were empty, sleeping in shifts so the kitchens never stopped. Medical personnel documented what they called the hunger winter of Hungary. It wasn't just the absence of food, it was systematic destruction. German forces had burned crops, confiscated livestock, blocked transport routes. Every act of survival had been met with punishment. The siege of Budapest alone left over 100,000 civilians dead, many from starvation. Children suffered the most. Their growth had halted, bones softening from lack of calcium, immune systems collapsing. Doctors recorded cases where children's bodies were so fragile that even recovery became dangerous. Too much food too quickly could kill them. The process of bringing them back to life had to be careful, measured, deliberate. Captain Elizabeth Harrow, an army nurse, described the task with devastating simplicity. "We fed them like newborns, one spoon at a time, each swallow a victory." Her unit set up what became known locally as the Miracle Room, a converted classroom filled with cots and blankets where malnourished children were treated around the clock. She recalled a boy named Ferenc, who hadn't spoken in weeks. When she handed him a bowl of soup, he looked at her, blinked and whispered, "Is it safe to eat?" She nodded. He took a sip, then smiled. It was the first smile anyone had seen from him. Within days, dozens of children began to recover. The Americans didn't see themselves as heroes. To them, this was survival made visible. Private Lewis said later, "You can win a war with guns, but you heal one with bread." The men rotated duties, some on kitchen lines, others delivering supplies into rural villages where the starvation had been even worse. In one hamlet on the Danube's edge, soldiers found only 70 survivors out of 400. They shared what they could, marked every child for medical attention, and buried the rest with dignity. The chaplain wrote in his diary, "We fed the living and prayed for the dead, and somehow it felt like the same act." As weeks passed, the cooperation between the U.S. forces and Hungarian civilians deepened into something larger than relief. It became restoration. Families invited soldiers into what remained of their homes, offering gratitude in the form of music, bread baked from donated flour, or simple words, "You saved our children." In return, the soldiers rebuilt wells, repaired roofs, and cleared rubble from schools. Children followed them everywhere, learning English phrases, laughing at the strange accents. War had made them old too soon, but kindness began turning them young again. By early June, relief efforts spread through western Hungary into the countryside. Each convoy became a symbol of rebirth. Every time a truck arrived, entire villages would gather at the road, waving flags made from torn sheets, cheering with hoarse voices. Food became more than survival. Mercer would later write in his memoir. It was proof that the world still cared. The psychological transformation was as remarkable as the physical one. Starvation had erased hope. Food restored it. Parents who had stopped dreaming began planning futures again. Teachers reopened schools. Churches held services of Thanksgiving, where American soldiers were invited to sit in the front pews. The city of Győr presented the 101st Division with a hand-stitched banner reading, "You fed us when no one else could." The division kept it as an unofficial emblem long after the war ended, but for the soldiers themselves, the meaning ran deeper than gratitude or recognition. They had entered Hungary as conquerors of tyranny and found themselves as witnesses to suffering that transcended politics. Feeding the starving became not just an act of mercy, but a kind of redemption for humanity, for the war, for themselves. Sergeant Mercer summed it up in his last letter home. "We came here carrying weapons. We're leaving with empty hands and full hearts. Because somewhere between the gunfire and the hunger, we remembered what we were fighting for." The liberation of Hungary's starving towns wasn't recorded as a major battle. It didn't change borders or rewrite treaties. But for the mothers who watched their children eat again, and for the soldiers who discovered that compassion could be as powerful as any weapon, it was victory in its purest form. For weeks after the first convoys arrived, Hungary's western villages lived in a rhythm of gratitude and exhaustion. The soldiers worked alongside locals who were still too frail to stand long, but insisted on helping unload trucks. Children lined the roads hours before dawn, waiting for the rumble of engines that meant life was returning. When the first rays of sunlight touched the shattered roofs of Sopron and Gaia, those same children were already waving, smiling through cracked lips, clutching empty tin cans like trophies. For them, each day of food wasn't just nourishment. It was proof that the nightmare might finally be ending. In one of the smaller towns along the Raba River, Captain Harrow's medical unit turned an abandoned school into a treatment center. She called it the place where silence learned to laugh again. The children there were in the worst condition she had ever seen. Many were little more than skeletons wrapped in skin. Yet within days, after careful feeding and constant attention, they began to recover. Their laughter filled the hallways, thin, fragile laughter, but laughter nonetheless. Soldiers often stopped by after their shifts just to listen. One medic remarked, "It sounds like hope has a sound, and that's it." Reports began reaching American command that the mortality rate among civilians had dropped by almost 60% within a month of sustained aid. Relief efforts extended outward into rural settlements where starvation had hidden from the front lines. Convoys crossed fields littered with wreckage, distributing flour, sugar, dried milk, and medical supplies. Local resistance members, once guerrilla fighters, now served as guides, leading trucks through minefields and broken bridges to reach isolated hamlets. They no longer carried rifles, only ledgers, marking how many mouths each delivery would feed. The American presence, initially viewed with cautious awe, became woven into the town's daily lives. Soldiers who once carried rifles now carried loaves of bread on their shoulders. They learned Hungarian words for thank you, child, and home. They shared cigarettes with fathers, told stories to mothers, and taught baseball to groups of thin, barefoot boys who had never seen a ball before. Sergeant Mercer, who had spent his first weeks in Hungary fighting back tears, began smiling again. "Every meal we serve feels like we're undoing a piece of what the war tried to erase," he wrote in his notebook. One morning, a little girl named Esther brought Mercer a handful of wildflowers. She had tied them with string, scavenged from a ration crate. "For America," she said shyly, placing them in his hand. He pinned them to his uniform, next to his campaign ribbons. Later, when a photographer captured the moment, it became one of the war's most enduring images, an American soldier kneeling to receive flowers from a child who had survived starvation. The image would later appear in newspapers across Europe under the caption, "Mercy arrives in Hungary." But mercy alone couldn't erase the scars left by hunger. Even as bodies healed, memories didn't. Doctors noted that many children continued to hoard bits of food under their pillows, afraid it might vanish overnight. Some refused to sleep until they'd seen soldiers restocking kitchens. "The war taught them that food means safety," Dr. Pierce explained. "It will take years for that fear to fade." Despite the trauma, recovery was visible everywhere. Hair regained color, cheeks rounded, laughter returned. And as the children regained their voices, they began telling stories of nights spent listening for bombers, of stealing turnips from frozen fields, of watching neighbors disappear. Soldiers who had thought themselves hardened by war listened, wordless, realizing that the true front line of suffering had been the hunger they could not see. By late summer 1945, relief operations had transformed from emergency feeding into rebuilding. American engineers restored bridges, reopened mills, and trained locals in logistics to ensure steady food supply. The cooperation became a template for post-war humanitarian policy across Europe. But within the ruins of Hungary, it was the personal connections that mattered most. Soldiers were invited into homes rebuilt from rubble. Families offered small gifts, embroidered cloths, carved wooden crosses, handwritten notes of thanks. Each bore the same message: "You saved our children." Mercer's division received orders to redeploy west for demobilization in September, but many soldiers petitioned to stay. "We can't leave now," one corporal told his commanding officer. "They're just starting to live again." Command eventually agreed to keep a detachment behind to assist ongoing aid missions. Before departure, the town organized a farewell gathering. Hundreds of civilians filled the square where the first rations had been handed out months earlier. A choir of schoolchildren, those same children who had once been starving, sang in halting English, "God bless America." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. When the music ended, an old priest stepped forward, holding a loaf of bread baked from the first full harvest since liberation. He handed it to Mercer. "We give this not as a symbol," the priest said, "but as a reminder. You fed us when no one else could." Mercer accepted it silently, tears cutting through the grime on his cheeks. In that moment, every battle he had fought felt secondary to what had happened here. After the soldiers left, the memory of those weeks remained etched into Hungarian history. Survivors spoke of the men who brought food instead of fire, and for decades, stories of the American convoys became part of local legend. Children who had once been fed by strangers grew up, started families, and taught their own children about the day the Americans came. Many kept the ration tins as relics, passing them down as heirlooms. In 1965, on the 20th anniversary of liberation, the city of Győr unveiled a bronze monument depicting a soldier kneeling to offer bread to a child. The inscription beneath read, "They came with courage, they stayed with compassion." At the dedication ceremony, now elderly survivors recited the names of soldiers they remembered: Mercer, Harrow, Lewis, Carter, and laid flowers at the base of the statue. Some wept quietly, others smiled, remembering the day hunger ended. The legacy extended beyond memory. The humanitarian model used in Hungary became a foundation for future Allied relief efforts in Europe and Asia. It was studied by post-war aid organizations and inspired the first international framework for food distribution under the newly formed United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. In a world reeling from destruction, the lesson learned in Hungary was simple but profound. Victory was hollow without mercy. For the Americans who served there, the experience defined their lives long after the uniforms were packed away. Sergeant Mercer returned home to Kansas and became a teacher. Every year, he told his students about the starving girl who'd smiled when handed chocolate, and how that moment had taught him more about humanity than all the medals ever could. "War shows you what people can destroy," he once told a reporter, "but compassion shows you what we can rebuild." Years later, the soldiers who had walked those frozen Hungarian streets struggled to describe what they had seen without their voices breaking. Combat they could explain. Starvation they could not. There was no enemy to shoot, no strategy to apply, only the unbearable sight of parents too weak to lift their children and the miracle of food transforming despair into life. Many veterans kept quiet for decades, not out of shame, but reverence. To them, it wasn't a war story. It was a moment of humanity that belonged to the people they had saved. Staff Sergeant Mercer carried the memory like a scar he didn't mind showing. In interviews long after the war, he said the day he fed a starving child meant more to him than every medal he'd earned. "We were soldiers," he said, "but that morning we were something else. We weren't fighting anymore. We were healing." His words echoed the thoughts of countless others who had served in those final months of 1945. They'd entered Hungary expecting battle and left with a lesson in compassion none of them forgot. For the Hungarian civilians, that compassion became part of their collective identity. Generations grew up on stories told at kitchen tables about the moment when the rumble of tanks didn't bring death, but salvation. Parents who'd once hidden children in cellars now told them about the Americans who came with bread instead of bullets. And every time the story was told, someone cried, because the memory of hunger never truly left. Even decades later, survivors could still recall the smell of that first hot meal, the weight of a soldier's hand offering food, the disbelief that the nightmare was finally over. The Hungarian famine of 1944–45 remains one of Europe's quietest tragedies. Overshadowed by larger wars and louder headlines, it existed mostly in diaries, photographs, and whispered recollections. Yet for those who lived it, it defined everything. In the archives of Budapest's National Museum, one journal written by a mother named Ilona Kovacs captures it best. "We waited for death, and instead the Americans came. They didn't ask who we were or what we believed. They only asked if we were hungry." Her daughter Anna, the same girl who once shared her bread with her brother, donated that diary in 1985, along with the empty tin of condensed milk she'd kept for 40 years. "It reminded me," she said, "that kindness can arrive even in ruins." In the aftermath of the war, Hungary faced years of reconstruction under shifting political powers. But through every regime and every new flag, the story of the Americans who fed the starving never vanished. Teachers recounted it in schools, priests in sermons, grandparents by fireplaces. In rural villages, anniversaries of liberation were marked not with parades but with meals shared among neighbors, often beginning with a single loaf of bread passed from hand to hand in silence before anyone took a bite. That ritual, simple and wordless, became a quiet act of remembrance. By 1950, many of the children who had survived thanks to those first American rations were in their teens. The physical scars of malnutrition had faded, but the emotional ones lingered. Doctors studying their recovery found something remarkable. Those who had received early, consistent nourishment recovered almost completely, while those who had gone longer without help bore lifelong health effects. Nutritionists and humanitarian planners cited the Hungarian relief as proof that timely intervention could save entire generations from permanent damage. That realization helped shape post-war global policies for famine response, from Europe to Asia and Africa. Out of tragedy, a template for mercy had emerged. The soldiers, too, carried their memories forward in ways that changed lives. Private Henry Lewis, who had carried the starving boy from the cellar, returned to the United States and became a physician. "I saw what hunger does," he told a university audience in 1962. "I swore I'd never let a child die for lack of food again." He founded a medical outreach program that operated for decades in impoverished regions worldwide. Captain Elizabeth Harrow, whose miracle room had saved dozens of children, joined the newly formed United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, helping design nutrition centers in post-war Europe. In interviews, she always traced her mission back to Hungary. "Those children," she said, "taught me that healing begins with feeding." Even decades later, the impact of those acts rippled outward. In 1975, during the 30th anniversary commemoration, the American ambassador to Hungary laid a wreath at the Guile Monument. Among the crowd were hundreds of gray-haired men and women who had once been those starving children. Some brought their own grandchildren, pointing to the bronze statue of the soldier and the child. "That was us," they told them. "That was the day we learned kindness doesn't need translation." Historians studying post-war Europe often speak of politics, treaties, and rebuilding economies. But in towns like Győr, Sopron, and Papa, the memory that endured wasn't of generals or borders. It was of men in foreign uniforms opening crates, of laughter returning to streets where only silence had lived. It was the sound of metal spoons against tin bowls, the first songs sung by children whose voices had gone quiet for too long. It was life, restored one bite at a time. The moral weight of those moments would outlive the war itself. In an era defined by destruction, the Americans' decision to prioritize feeding civilians became one of the earliest large-scale humanitarian operations led by a military force. It demonstrated that compassion could operate on the same scale as combat and win. The lesson wasn't lost on the world. In later decades, from Berlin to Korea to Kosovo, soldiers carrying food would follow a pattern set by those who once entered Hungary with full hearts and empty hands. As the century turned, the few surviving veterans were honored by both American and Hungarian governments. When asked how they wanted to be remembered, their answers were almost identical. Not as heroes, Mercer said in one of his last recorded interviews, but as men who did what anyone should do when they see a hungry child. He paused, then added softly, "We just happened to be there when it mattered." And for the Hungarians who lived because they were there, gratitude became a generational inheritance. Families still light candles every May to honor the day American trucks rolled in. Some sing the same hymn those children once sang in the town square, the one that made soldiers weep. The song's last line translates simply to, "They fed us, and we lived." There is a story told in Western Hungary that has become almost legend. It says that during the first night of liberation, after food had been distributed and fires burned warm again, a soldier stood on the steps of a ruined church, looking at the sky. A child approached and asked him why he was crying. He replied, "Because tomorrow you'll wake up hungry again, and I can't stay forever." The child took his hand and said, "Then I will eat for both of us." Whether the story is true, no one knows, but in a land once defined by hunger, it feels right, because the people did eat again. They lived, they rebuilt, and they never forgot. What happened in Hungary in 1945 wasn't just the liberation of a nation, it was the redemption of humanity at its simplest level. The soldiers who broke open rations and fed dying children proved that victory isn't measured by territory taken or flags raised, but by lives restored. Their kindness became a monument not built from stone but from memory, one that still stands, invisible but unbreakable, in every act of compassion that follows. So, when you hear about the end of the Second World War, remember not only the battles fought, but the quiet moments after, when soldiers traded weapons for bread, when tears replaced gunfire, when an entire people rediscovered what it meant to hope. Because in those moments, history wasn't just written, it was healed. If this story moved you, take a moment to share it. Like this video, subscribe for more stories of courage and compassion, and tell us in the comments what you felt reading this one. Because stories like these remind us that, even in war's darkest hours, kindness can still light the way forward.